In this section, we're going to explore the elasticity of cloud resources with respect to quotas and limits. We're going to explain why quotas and limits are important and how they can actually be your friend in a cloud environment. Let's kick off the conversation with an overview of quotas and limits. Quotas and limits are generally used to set a cap on resource usage. This can be quite important in terms of minimizing or mitigating the risk of runaway costs. Examples can include limits on CPUs per regions or limits on the number of IP addresses. It is also important to remember that having a higher quota or a higher limit does not necessarily imply you will always have access to the resources you need. That depends on the availability within the specific data center facility. And it is worth highlighting that quotas and limits serve an important function in that it gets us to reassess our needs. It gets us to reflect on what our requirements are and put in place guardrails that prevent unforeseen usage and unforeseen spikes in costs. Let's move on to the first topic, which is quotas. Quotas are very important because they enable us to restrict access to resources and services in the cloud, but quotas are not fixed. They can be increased depending on the needs of a particular user. In other words, many quotas are soft as opposed to hard quota limits. Quotas are very important because they help us to mitigate the risk of unforeseen spikes in usage and billing costs. Runaway costs are typically caused by misconfiguration and sometimes through malicious intent. Quotas are usually soft caps, and in many clouds, users can either raise support tickets to have quotas increased, or some cloud providers would allow users to increase the quotas by themselves, permissions allowing. It is also worth mentioning that free trials usually have additional quotas in place to enable users to experience the relevant services. And finally, this is a reminder of the fact that users can always request an increase in quotas by raising a support ticket. Let's continue on our conversation, and this time around, we're going to have a look at limits. Limits affect the total amount of resources that can be used. A limit can be a fixed number, for example, a restriction that limits a user to assigning a maximum of 5 IP addresses. Limits can also be time-bound, for example, a limit that affects how long a service can run. And finally, rate limits affect the rate at which resources can be consumed or accessed. In a subsequent module, we're going to demonstrate how these concepts can be applied to compute-based resources on the public cloud.